My next guest is Charles Williams. He has served in urban education for 15 years as a teacher, assistant principal, and principal while working with students in grade PK through 12. He has developed innovative programs and structures that have resulted in successful schools in both Indiana and Illinois. He's also presented and spoken at numerous events. Charles is a founder of CW Consulting, an education consulting group, host of the Counter Narrative podcast, and the host of Real Educators Talk, a monthly discussion designed to engage educators in authentic conversations around education. Welcome to the podcast, Charles.
Thank you for having me, Dana. How are you?
Great, great. Well, tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
Yes, I think the biggest trench that I've ever been in, and I've said this story before, so if you've heard it, I do apologize. But when I first started working at the school that I was at prior to where I am now,
Mm-hmm.
I was there for 6 years, and I was brought in as a principal, and they said, "Well, hey, welcome to the school. By the way, your school is slated to be shut down
Mm-hmm.
for poor academic performance." And talk about not even falling in the trench, being thrown inside
Mm-hmm.
of a trench. Um, and so the very first year, we tried to do everything that we could, by the book, right? We
Mm-hmm.
we changed all of our curriculum. We bought a ton of new material, right? We textbook, and I felt really good about it. I thought, hey, this is it. We're going to get ourselves pulled out, and we didn't. Our scores barely moved. I had to go stand in front of the board because that was there last year. And I said, look,
Mm-hmm.
I'm brand new. Can you give me a shot? I know the first year didn't go as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so they gave us two.
Okay.
Everybody else was getting 3 years, 5 years for their renewals. We got two.
Okay.
So it was like, okay, we have to get this turned around. And that summer, I remember just looking at something we had called the Five Essentials. It's a survey
Mm-hmm.
that focuses on a lot of different things, but the biggest is being culture and climate within the building. And what I quickly realized was that our culture and climate was horrible. Nobody wanted to be there. Students didn't feel safe. They didn't feel like they were valued or heard. Teachers didn't feel like they had any input. Nobody wanted to be there. And so it was like, I started thinking about all the things that I've heard, right? It's people, not programs.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, let's shift our attention a little bit. Let's pour into the people that we have because we couldn't figure out what was wrong with the curriculum. And the reality was there was nothing wrong with the materials of the curriculum. Like none of that means anything if you don't have people who are want to be in the building, who are willing to do the work. And so we turned it around, and within 2 years, we reached and surpassed our goal, and we were off of the closure list, the academic warning list, which was a huge accomplishment, but it taught me in that moment, like, a lot of times we immediately jump onto the newest, shiniest thing,
Yeah.
looking for the best program to fix the issues that we have. And more often than not, it isn't the programs that we had to focus on people. And so that was year three. I was able to get us out, or we were able to get us out, to be honest. And then the next 3 years, we just continued on and, continued to show tremendous gains. And it was exciting. But, my time there came to an end. I
Mm-hmm.
shifted into another district, but definitely was thrown into the trenches and crawled ourselves back out.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people who've worked in turnaround schools that have found out that, it starts with that piece of recognizing the school culture and the relationships in the building. And yeah, you can try as you may bringing in stuff that curriculum, pedagogy, trainings, X, Y, and Z. But really realizing that and having been there and now coming out on the other side and telling the story, um, it's a look back kind of how you and your staff were able to achieve that. So you have a new book. It's called Inside the Principal's
Mm-hmm.
Office, a leadership guide to inspire reflection and growth. And so, was this partly written going through this experience you talked about? And tell me kind of what principals can gain from reading this.
Sure. So the book is about a year old. So
Okay.
definitely written afterwards.
Hmm.
But the book was written as a spin-off for the show that I have inside the
Hmm.
principal's office. Me and my co-host Michael McWilliams, we were approached by Dr. Rob Thornell, and he said, "Hey, I
Okay.
have this idea for a book. I think it would be awesome, and I want to write it with the two of you." So we said, "Okay." So we sat down and we wrote a book. And what it essentially was the show is designed to say, hey, teachers and most instructors, there's a lot of spaces
Hmm.
for teachers to come together, for them to learn and grow, connect, build, bond, right? All of those things. But where are the spaces like that for educational administrators?
Yeah.
And a lot of times they say leadership is lonely, and it can be, but my pushback on that is it's only lonely if you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
So let's create a space for these leaders to come together, and that's what the show was about. And so then we took the book to say, hey, how can we provide a resource to administrators? We know they're
Okay.
busy, right? We know we don't always have a time, to sit down and read for hours on end. So what can we create a resource for administrators by administrators? And so what we did was we took 40 weeks, right, about the approximate time frame for a school year, and we said, what if an administrator read through it week by week,
Hmm.
just a quick anecdotal story? So the
Okay.
three of us shared our experiences, and then at the end, there's space to capture your thoughts and reflections. And it
Okay.
focuses on different areas of leadership: servant leadership, instructional leadership, learning, just continuing your own learning, celebrations and reflections. And so we share a story, and then it says, now we want you to reflect on it. Here are some questions, reflect, process. And so our hope is that as principals and administrators, leaders go through the school year, they're able to kind of digest this, right? 1 week at a time, short, simple, but really making sure that they're reflecting on the work. And so it's great for a brand new administrator to say, what am I getting myself into? But it's also great for those veterans, because sometimes we get just so caught up in routines and ruts, right? We're just kind of moving along that we don't really take the time to stop and say, why am I here? What am I doing? Am I being effective? And so the book
Mhm.
was really designed for both sides of that coin.
Yeah, and this is something, would a principal be able to use this maybe in uh, admin team meetings, kind of as a partial book study with their admin team? Would that be appropriate?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact,
Mhm.
we've had multiple districts who have purchased the book for exactly that. I mean, it can be a solo journey, but definitely something to sit down together, like a book study. So we've had superintendents purchase it for their principals across the district, and they utilize it as a book study. I've developed a PLC around that I
Mhm.
can run
Mhm.
with leaders, but as well as even just a leader right within a building to say, hey, I'm going to give one to my AP, I'm going to give one to my dean, I'm going to give
Mhm.
it to the leaders within our school. Because one of the other things we stress is that it says principal, because at the time we wrote it, we were all sitting principals.
Yeah.
But the truth is, it's for leaders, right? And so a leader could be almost anyone in your building. And so they can take and learn from this.
Mhm. Mhm. So even maybe teacher leaders, department chairs to discuss in maybe their meetings as well, to reflect on. Like you said, it's a lot, that reflection piece going back. Is it kind of a weekly, like you said, it's divided up into weeks? So if
Mhm.
people had a weekly team meeting, is it by theme or just kind of posing questions based on how the book's laid out?
Yeah, so I mean, if for example, if a school had a weekly team meeting,
Okay.
very easily, right? But each story is maybe a page, page and a half,
Okay.
two at the most. So
Mm-hmm.
they're not very long. So very easily something that could be read, the week prior, and then
Mm-hmm.
and discussed and digested. And what's
Okay.
wonderful is that those questions could even be used as conversational questions. So for example, one of the chapters talks about um, just kind of walking your talk, right?
Okay.
So in that chapter, I talked about the fact we had a rule: we don't eat in the hallways
Mm-hmm.
for a variety of reasons. And I was running to a meeting, running down the hallway, picked up something from the cafeteria, and it was eating it on my way to my office. And a student stopped me and said, "Hey, you're not supposed to be eating in the hallway." And a teacher immediately started to reprimand the student. And I said, "No, no, no, no. He's absolutely right. like I shouldn't be eating in the hallway. That is not my rule. That's not a rule for students. That is a school-wide expectation and norm. And as the school leader, I of all people should be upholding that expectation. I thank the student for the reminder, right? I remember seeing his face and the teacher's face,
Mhm.
like, wait, what just happened? Um, but then it's like at the end of it, it's asking those questions, like, what are you allowing to happen in your school? Right.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
sometimes that's a challenging question because we say we have a rule, but I'm going to do this. Right.
yeah.
As a leader, are you following the expectations that you have set forth? And
Mhm.
sometimes that's something challenging as a leader to be like, yeah, but I'm the principal. Yeah. That means that of anybody, you should be doing it. And
Mhm.
so it's questions like that that could be had in conversations to reflect on practices to say, okay, how are we going to move forward, right? What are we going to make sure that we're focusing on? What are we going to do as we're moving forward? And so definitely something that could be utilized, on a week to week basis, for team meetings, staff meetings, however that structure is set up.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and these small things, like really reflecting on, uh, you know, the adults bending the rules, right? Sometimes we're the worst students, like in PD, right?
Yeah,
Those types of
yeah.
things. So reflecting on like how much are you following the vision, and values, those types of things. So definitely recommend. So you told me that before the book was written, it was kind of a side part from the show inside the
Mhm.
principal's office. So tell me a little bit about where people can access the show, how often it's put out, and who you do the show with.
Yeah, so typically the show comes out twice a month, the first and
Mhm.
third Saturday of the month. During the holidays, right now, we've kind of scaled it back. So the very first Saturday of December, we'll have our
Okay.
last show for the year. It's hosted by School Rubric. Wallace Ting runs School Rubric. And about 2 years ago, he came to me and Michael McWilliams, who was
Mhm.
a 20-year veteran principal down in Denton ISD, down in Texas.
Mhm.
And he said, hey, look, I have an idea for a show. What are your thoughts on this? And I had done a few other shows on for School Rubric, and I said, let's give it a shot. So we played around a little bit with it. Officially launched it about February. So in February, it'll be 2 solid years.
Okay.
But you can find the shows, if you subscribe to School Rubric on YouTube, you can find all the past episodes there. But if you follow either myself or Michael McWilliams or School Rubric across any social media outlet, so when we go live, we promote it across Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, just all the socials. So if you want to find the show, it's very easy to find it.
And do you frame your episodes around a certain topic as well, or is it kind of just really about something you've experienced in the job? Because you mentioned in the pre-chat you're the only one of the three that is still in the job as a principal. So,
Yeah, yeah. So Mike has left. He is part of
mhm,
Solution Tree. So I
mhm,
mean, kudos because that's a huge step, right? A lot of people want to get into that role.
mhm,
So
mhm.
he travels around the country now delivering PD for them. Rob, he hasn't been in that role for a while. He's actually now working with NWEA. So yeah, I'm the only one in the role currently. But what we do is we talk about some of the hottest topics. In December, what we do is we kind of talk about like wrapping up the year. Depending on the times of year, we either have kind of some steady ones, like how do we find good talent and not just find them, but how do we retain them? How do we curate great back to school orientations? Sometimes it's just something that's very popular. It might be conversations around, when like critical race theory was really big in it, right? Let's have a conversation around that. And
Mhm.
so it's really creating a space for, again, educational leaders to sit down and say, can we talk about this? And so typically it's me and Mike, and we have
Okay.
two leaders on the show. And I mean, they're from all over. We've had leaders from, Europe, from Asia, from South America, from the Middle East, as well as leaders right here from, the United States. And so what we're really trying to do as well is create a global perspective. And so it's very interesting sometimes when we're talking about a topic, and we kind of are like, we're here in America, right? This is kind of how
Mhm,
we view it.
mhm, mhm.
But it's interesting for a school leader in Germany to say, hey, we're dealing with the same thing. Or a school leader in Thailand who's like, well, this is how we approached it. And it's, it's just, I guess, an interesting perspective that sometimes we think, again, that we're unique, that we're dealing with the situation,
Yeah.
but in reality, things are impacting schools around the world. And, so it's just really nice to be able to get that global perspective.
Yeah, and it makes the world smaller when you see like people are also having similar issues as we
Yeah.
are. So you also host the Counter Narrative podcast, changing the way we talk and think about education. So talk to me a little bit about how long this podcast has been on and how often it drops and kind of what the setup, what the themes are in that podcast as well.
Yeah, so the podcast is about 2.5 years old. It really launched during the pandemic, I think, when so
Okay.
many of these things, right? Like, we're
Yeah.
sitting at home, what else are we going to do? But it stems off of an article that I read by my a good friend, Dr. Tyrone Howard, uh,
Okay.
who examined, young African American males and said, these gentlemen were successful. Why were they successful? Let's tell the story about why they're successful, because so often we focus on, the negative narrative. And I thought, this is great. I've spent, almost 18 years now in urban education, where I
Mhm,
go into these meetings and we continue to have the same conversations over and over and over again, right? The
mhm,
same students are being blamed, right? The same students are being marginalized and focused on. And it's just the same kind of conversations and topics. And I thought, what if we change this up a little bit? Because
mhm,
I
mhm.
knew as a leader, my school had a tremendous amount of success in these stories, but those stories aren't being told.
Yeah.
And any group of people, if you continue to only talk about them in a negative way, you create this deficit mindset. So my thought
Mhm,
was, well, man, if we change the way we're talking about things, we're starting to change the way we think. If we change the way we think, we change the way we act, right? And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
mhm,
And so I created the show. And so what I wanted to do is to talk to educators who wanted to say, hey, let me tell my story. Let me tell you the
mhm,
story of the students that I've had in my space. Let me tell you about my experiences and really create a space where we can push back. And it's been interesting because I've had educators, we've talked about like rural education, something I never have been involved in, but kind of talking about what does that look like? We've talked about tech integration. We've talked about assessments. We've talked about body image and emotional mental health. I mean, the podcast has really hit on almost every topic that you could think of, but really pushing through a different perspective. Um, and so they alternate, they drop every single week. And so one week I have a guest. And so it's always, some type of educator. I really don't have any criteria. It
mhm,
doesn't have to be a
mhm.
leader. It's just an educator. And then the following week is a reflection. I call them my pause to ponder moments. And
Okay.
so in those, that's just me literally talking about something that has come up that week or the week prior that's really weighing on myself as an educator. And so
Mhm,
I just talk about it. Um, and so yeah, it drops every single Friday, and it can be found across essentially every single podcast platform. The biggest ones are Spotify and Apple,
mhm,
you can find it almost anywhere. And it's really interesting when I look at the dashboard and I see listeners from all over the world.
mhm,
It's just like, oh, look, New Zealand's checking in, or whatever. It's like, that's cool. But
mhm.
yeah, I'd feel free. I'd be honored if somebody checked it out and listened in.
Yeah, yeah, and I see that dashboard as well as a podcast host, and it's flattering to know like there are people in other countries that hear about it and want to check it out. And I really like the background of how you define your title. Really, we're trying to change the narrative, as you said, and really coming out of the deficit mindset, um, you know building into that growth mindset, and seeing celebrating stories of our staff and our students. So, yeah, I will put the links in the show notes so people can check that
Thank
out. And in the bio, I also mentioned that you run CW Consulting.
you. Yeah.
So tell me when you launched your consulting firm and kind of what you do as a consultant and what people can book you, what you can speak to if people want to book you to come and speak to their staff.
Yeah, so this was launched in February of 2019.
Mm-hmm.
So I was at the ESSA conference here in Chicago,
Okay.
presenting on vocabulary instruction. So I was an ELA teacher forever, before
Okay.
becoming an administrator. And so, one of the big things was just vocabulary, right?
Yeah.
Students need to increase their vocabulary. So I created an entire workshop on that. In fact, I was a contributor to a book called Word Nerds, which was a focus on vocabulary. So I took some of
Okay.
that and created this workshop. And I remember presenting at the conference, and after my session was done, a rep came up to me and said, "Hey, we would love for you to present to our teachers. Can you run a workshop?" I was like, "Yeah, of course I can." They're like, "Awesome, we'll be in touch." And I remember looking at my wife and I was like, like, what did I just do?
Yeah.
Um, so I figured right now I'm just a guy presenting workshops. Let me kind of make this a little more formal. And so I launched the consulting company. And since then, it has been phenomenal, right? The other day, it just dawned on me. It's only been like we're just going on to 4 years. But during that time, I've had the opportunity to host workshops, um, and to speak at conferences, and just launch, like the show and the book, and the podcast off of that. This past summer, I spoke in Louisville. I was in Vegas. I It was one other spot. I was down in New Orleans.
Mhm.
I was in Dallas or Austin earlier in the year. And so just being able to go to these spaces and being in spaces where there's standing room only, right? To say like, oh my
Mhm.
goodness, like people actually want to come and listen. I
Uh-huh.
remember in Vegas, I had two ballrooms and I walked
Wow.
in the night before
Wow.
and it was just like, oh, like like it weighed on me. But the next morning when I went in and I got ready, and sure enough, it started filling in, and it was like this. It's just surreal because I remember not too long ago sitting in the audience and watching the people present and share, and it was kind of like, I wonder what that's like. And now I'm on the other side of that, and so it's been phenomenal. But a lot of the work that I've been doing lately really focuses on equitable leadership. One of the biggest workshop or presentation that I have right now, it's called the problem with color blindness.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that one has become extremely popular. But one of the biggest workshops, the most popular workshops, is based on this equity framework. So I've done some work with CPS, the Chicago Public Schools. I realize anywhere outside of Chicago, like CPS is Child Protective Services, and so I want
Hmm.
to.
Yeah, no, I
People are
get
like, "Wait, what?"
it.
So we created a framework that says like everybody's talking about equity, but how do you actually do it? So
Yeah.
we created a framework to help with that. And so that's a workshop that I run on, like, this is how we do it, right? What is a problem that you have, and how can we apply this framework? But yeah, there's a website out there, and of course the Twitter handle goes by the same name as well as all the other socials. But if anybody was interested in saying, hey, we want a keynote, or we want a speaker at our conference, as well as, or we want somebody to come in and present to our teachers, feel free to reach out via that avenue.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting how that got started, just based off of the vocabulary workshop. And really, you kind of hit the gold pot there, right? When, they came and they saw, and then they wanted to bring you in. So it's kind of very unexpected.
Yeah, that it was,
Yeah.
and I felt like I needed to create. I was like, oh wait, at the time, I'll be honest, like I was brand new to it, so I felt I need to create this brand, right? Because
Mhm.
otherwise, I'm just a guy going in and doing a
Yeah.
workshop. And
Yeah.
so, I had thought about it for a while, but that was my launching point, and I'm so glad, right? February 2019 came around because like that pushed me into it, and then of course we know what happened a year later, but.
Did you do a lot of virtual consulting and speaking at conferences during that time as well?
Yeah, so during the pandemic, there was a lot, right? Because we were all sitting at home looking at our computers. So there was a lot of virtual sessions. In fact, there was one there I talked about. I created an acronym for smart leadership,
Okay.
SMART. That was the acronym. And so just taking our experiences during the pandemic and how I believe, because that's how I lead, and I say
Okay.
this is what smart leadership is. Like
Mhm.
literally, in my perspective, it's being
Mhm.
smart. But the acronym of slowing down, right? A lot of times, we rush into things.
Uh-huh.
So it was like, let's slow things down. Let's kind of make some lists. Where are we at? Right?
Okay.
We look at those lists. We kind of go through them. Um, then we redefine our focus. So a
Okay.
lot of times we like to focus on things that are not within our control.
Okay.
So like, okay, let's focus on that. And then those are the things that we start to focus on, implement, and then T of course is tracking it. So it was like during the pandemic, I remember a lot of my colleagues like, here's our 30 points bulletin about how we're going to address the. I was like, how do you have that? Like nobody knows what this is.
Yeah.
So me and my staff, we took a whole different thing. We're like, let's slow things down a little bit,
Mhm.
right? And
Mhm.
and let's really be intentional about next steps and focus. And it really got us through because I felt really guilty during the pandemic. Again, a lot of my peers who had all these multi-point steps, and I would read or we'd sit in meetings and they're freaking out and it's chaos. And they're like, Charles, how are you guys doing? And I
Yeah.
felt really guilty, but I was like, we're pretty good.
Mhm.
Like we're navigating this. But again, I think part of that was that slowing down process. I don't know. I think we as educators, a lot of times we always feel like we need to have the answer.
Yeah.
And I'm okay saying, I don't know.
Mhm.
Let's figure this thing out. Instead of surging forward and then having this come back and then pushing forward and coming back. Like let's figure this thing out and then move forward. So that way our time, effort, energy, everything's intentional, and then we make that much more of an impact.
Yeah, no, it seems like you had the tools in place before the pandemic hit that you were able to really, like you said, wait, be patient, not jump into decisions that weren't thoroughly thought out, right? And you have the network as well, having had this show and, really being intentional about
Right.
the choices you made.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, out of everything we talked about today on the podcast, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
Um, I'll say this. So a lot of times when people ask me, like, you're doing a lot of stuff, right? My
Mhm,
my wife
mhm.
hates it, to be
Yeah.
honest, but I think for anybody, when I think about all the different things that I'm doing, and this goes for anybody, is to know your purpose, know your why. So I ground myself in that. Brandon Beck in his book, good friend of mine, and in his book, he created like this mission statement format, and I utilized that to create my own. And when you know why you're showing up, when you know why you wake up each and every single day,
Mhm.
the steps that you take can be intentional. And so, yes, I have a bunch of different things happening, but it's all moving in the same direction.
Yeah.
And I
Mhm.
remember early on when I first started this whole consulting thing, I was just kind of like, what do you need? You need this? I'll do that for you. Do you need this? I'll do that.
Mhm.
And I sat down with Ray from the Teach Better team, and she was like, Charles, no, like you really have to focus,
Yeah.
figure out what it is that you want to do. And so that would be my message, right? Because I know a lot of times we listen to stories like this or we see
Yeah.
this and
Yeah.
people want to launch into it. But before you start that journey, figure out what is your purpose, what is your why, focus everything on that, and then launch into it. And as long as you ground yourself in that space, everything else is going to be okay. You might kind of hit obstacles, you might not get confused about next steps,
Mhm.
but as
Mhm.
long as you're grounded there, you're going to be okay and you can move forward. It has made a
Mhm.
world of a
Mhm.
difference for me.
Yeah, no, and I really get that importance of grounding. Like when you are involved in a lot of different things, like you mentioned, you have your day job and you have your side gigs, and really, really knowing like the purpose of serving kids and the purpose of helping staff, and putting out the word, like myself, putting out this media, this podcast form and books, and yeah, very important. And I will also spoken with Brandon Beck on the podcast. Highly recommend Unlocking Unlimited Potential, the book you
Yes.
referred to. So where can people connect with you and find you online? I know you mentioned a couple of websites and handles. Where's the easiest place to find you?
So the easiest is just jump on Twitter and you can find me at _CW Consulting. I have a link tree there on my Twitter page, so you can find all the other things. But that's probably the easiest space to get in touch. And then if you follow me, I always do a follow back. If you message me, then we could kind of navigate to needs or whatever it may be. But
Okay.
yeah, you could find across all the socials. There's even a TikTok. I don't know what to do with it, but I claim the handle. So I was like, it's mine. At some point, I might
Yeah.
push out content. I don't know.
Okay, great, great. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. Have a great rest of your day.
You do the same, Dana. Thank you for allowing me to be here.